Today's talk is going to be about the Bills of Mortality, which I'll explain what they are in a moment. At the end of the talk, do fill out one of these slips here to enter our prize draw for a copy of the book, 1000 Years of London Treasures, which is published by Guildhall Library. If you haven't seen them, this should be on your chair, which tells you what's happening the rest of the week. And tomorrow's my favourite talk, because it's the one I actually know a lot about tomorrow, which is the one about Jack Shepherd, so it should be quite a good one. Not that this one won't be a good one. Okay, so Bills of Mortality. The Bills of Mortality to do with plague. So I just wanted to tell you something about the history of plague in this country, just to give you an idea of how often there has been plague, and the fact that we only remember sort of two periods of plague, the Black Death and the Great Plague of 1665, but the plague happened lots of other times too. So this is just a list of major outbreaks of plague. So in 1258 was the first recorded outbreak of plague, and then about a century later, what we now call the Black Death, which was the plague that spread over the whole of Europe, in fact the whole of the world. But as you can see, throughout the following centuries, there were plagues all the time, just because they were lesser outbreaks and fewer people died. We don't remember them as well, and they're not written down in history as well. As you can see, this is just to do with this country, and mostly to do with London. We go on a bit. Had you been living in 1664 in London, 1664, and somebody said, what was the Great Plague year, then the people in London would have said either 1603 or 1625, because those are the Great Plague years that people remembered before 1665 changed everybody's view of when a Great Plague year was. So in 1663, the plague probably started in Stepney. As you can see, 2,798 people died in 1 week. That's 1 week in the city alone. And imagine it's a much, much smaller city than we know today. King James's coronation, James I, James VI of Scotland, his coronation was delayed because of the plague. He didn't want to come to London, basically, and be crowned amongst the plague. The next plague, and probably the most significant one of the 17th century until 1665, was 1625. And that was a summer plague, and it killed about 35,000 people in London. Obviously it's killing people in the rest of the country, but London, about 35,000 people. 1638 to 43, there was a rumbling plague, and some years there would just be a few deaths, and then it would go up and go down again. So rumbling plague, starting in 1638, rumbles on for about 5 or 6 years, affects mostly the congested parts of London. And by the congested parts, we mean actually those areas just on the boundary of London. So St Andrew's Holborn, St Giles Cripplegate, they're the most congested parts of London. The sort of suburbs of 17th century London. It's where the poorer people lived. The richer people lived around this area on Cheapside. That was the rich place to live in the city of London. And wasn't as congested, it had bigger houses, much more congested on the outskirts of London. And then in 1665 is the Great Plague that we all learn about. It was the most dramatic plague of the 17th century, but I think it's probably better known because it's linked with the Great Fire of London the year later. So 2 years of complete disaster for the city of London. But most interestingly, and I don't know the answer to this one, it was the last major outbreak of plague in this country. So no more plague, just disappeared virtually. There was a large outbreak of plague in Marseille in the 1720s. And you can still get plague today. Plague still exists today, but there's been no massive outbreak of plague in this country since 1665. Just to give you an example of how many people, you can have this sort of count how many people died, you can look at the parish registers. These are the parish registers for 1629 for burials in St Giles Cripplegate. And as you can see, there's probably about 15 to 20 people buried. But if we look at the parish registers for 1625, that Great Plague year before 1665, this is the number of people who died in that one parish. So you can see the lists are much, much longer. And in fact, what you can't see is what it says at the top. And it says there, the names of such as died in the year 1625, being the year of the Great Plague. So that's what they thought was the year of the Great Plague. Wherein, for the reason of the death of the minister and of the clerk, and for want of some books and notes in their hands, which could not be had, this book cannot be better perfected. So, i.e., The minister had died, the clerk had died, and all these people had died, so somebody had to record the burials. So somebody, who wasn't the clerk or minister, wrote down all these burials. And as you can see here, whole families died. Elizabeth Crowson, Francis Crowson, William Crowson, and his wife, Alexander Crowson. So whole families were dying in 1625, and yet we've almost forgotten about that as being a great plague year. So let's get on to Bills of Mortality. So what are the Bills of Mortality? They basically are a record of disease in London, a weekly record of disease. And John Strype, who was a great historian of London, wrote this in the 1720s, that the weekly bills were appointed long ago, and it was actually appointed in the 16th century, to know how the city stands in regard to the health and sickness of its inhabitants, with a view to acting to stop the spread of infection. He also tells us that when anyone died in the parish, after the tolling or ringing of the bell, the searchers were asked by the sexton to go to the place where the corpse lay and make a judgment about the cause of death and report it to the parish clerk. The clerk provided his account on Tuesday to the clerk of the hall, where the general account was made up and printed for publication on Thursday. So essentially what's happening, the parish clerks, and each parish would have a clerk, and they belong to what is essentially a guild of parish clerks, would collect the burials, details, the number of people who have been buried and what they died of, or at least in the opinion of the local people what they died of, record that, send it into a central place, and then it will be printed up and distributed around the city. So just get an idea of what the city might have been like in this period. Essentially, this boundary here, the coloured boundary, is basically what the city was like in the 17th century. That is what the city boundary is today. And all these coloured areas are the parishes. And uniquely, London has over 100 parishes, about 113 parishes in this square mile, which is unique in the whole of the country. No other city comes close to that. We can't go into the history of why that might be, but it's probably the most parishes in a city anywhere in the world. So you can see each of those had a clerk, and they all recorded the burials and the deaths of individuals. So the Bills of Mortality. They're written up initially and then they're printed. So the parishes are divided into 4 sections, 97 within the walls, within the actual ancient walls of the city, 16 outside, some in Middlesex and Surrey, so those bits like Islington is in Middlesex, Southwark is in Surrey, and we think of them as central London now, but they were in counties at that point. The Liberties, those are bits of London that don't fall into the parish, like the Inns of Court, the Liberty of Saffron Hill. They're not actual parishes, but they need to be counted for their burials and deaths. And then suburban parishes in Hackney, Islington, Stepney, Lambeth, Yeovington, Rotherhithe, etc. And people understood what within or without the Bills of Mortality meant. People in London, if we'd asked you all in the 17th century, is a particular parish within or without the Bills of Mortality, you would know. Everyone was aware of that sort of boundary in the same way they're aware of what Greater London is today. You'd know that Havering is in Greater London, and that Chelmsford is not in Greater London, for instance. In the 17th century, you would have been aware of what the range of Bills of Mortality were. They recorded disease and casualties listed together in alphabetical order. Just to give you another sense of what the City of London looked like, all those tiny parishes. And this is a Bill of Mortality, but these are the original manuscript versions that we have here. They're divided into 2 parts. The top part is a form that's filled in hand. So this is filled in by the Parish Clerks Company. As you can see, it's for one particular week. This is for the 9th of May to 16th of May, 1665, it goes across the top. And then it records the number of burials in each parish. These are all the parish names. And it would also, in the next column, record deaths from plague, if they were actually recorded. And there are just a couple of deaths from plague on here. There's one there. St Giles in the Fields, which is where lots of people think the plague actually started in London. St Giles in the Fields. In case you don't know where it is, St Giles in the Fields is just near Foyle's bookshop. It's just on Charing Cross Road. If you go behind the shops to the east on Charing Cross Road, there's a large church called St Giles in the Fields, and that's where the parish was. It was very densely populated, a very poor parish. So it's not surprising that the plague possibly started there. So this is to record the burials and record the number of deaths from plague, because essentially what the city were trying to do is to spot the plague breaking out and try and do something about it. So they did this week in, week out. They did it from the 16th century up to the 19th century, and it's the longest continuous record of disease statistics anywhere in the world. It's completely and utterly unique. It's investigated by and studied by people from all over the world. Whether or not people are interpreting a disease correctly in the 17th century, they probably weren't. They won't recognise what diseases were. At least we can see the number of infections as opposed to the number of deaths from other causes. So that Bill of Mortality was then printed, and this is a printed version, exactly the same, printed week by week, and it was distributed to important people around the city. So that's what a whole Bill of Mortality for 1 week looks in manuscript. And as you can see down the bottom, it lists the diseases that the searchers or the individuals went to look at bodies decided that somebody had died of. We'll look at those in more detail in a moment. Right, so how they compiled these records. So the return contained the information the clerk had received and diagnosed from the searchers about the causes of death. And you think, what are the searchers? Well, the searchers were 2 honest and discreet matrons, and they were usually women, chosen from the parish and sworn before a JP or a Dean of the Arches. That comes from Brett James, who's a historian of London, who records that. They were sometimes anything from discreet, sober and honest, so that's what is blames they were unreliable. They described the diseases or the corpse to the clerk, but were poor women and not experts. So that's also something we need to remember. They were the weak link in the chain, sometimes forced to do the job they didn't want to do, and they were sort of almost blackmailing into doing it. Their poverty made it likely that they're being open to bribes, and we'll come to why somebody might want to bribe the searcher. And they could be segregated from the public if there was some fear of contamination, because they had to look at all the dead bodies. Okay, so why might the information be reliable or unreliable? Deaths were often misrepresented for various reasons, and that would be if somebody had died of plague, and the searcher recognised they died of plague, then they might lock the house up. They might lock everybody in the house. So a family might encourage the searcher to say, well, they didn't die of plague, they died of consumption. Can you just say they died of consumption? We can have a decent burial and then we won't get all locked up in our house quarantined. So nurses often misrepresented the plague because they didn't want to be quarantined. As I say, people could be locked up for 40 days in the house if plague was found in there. Neighbours might not want to say there's plague in their area, so there are lots of reasons why they might be covering it up. Some people saw plague as punishment from God, so that if you're being punished, you must have done something wrong. So that might be another reason not to record the deaths from plague. People who are found dead in the street might not be recorded as having died of plague. Another reason that the numbers might be lower than actually was the truth. There was a shortage of people to do the searching, but the reporting of other diseases rose at the same time. I'll come back to that in a moment. Just jumping on, dissenters were accused of failing to report and misreporting. So this is a sort of anti-dissenter feeling going on, saying that basically the dissenters are not doing what they should be doing. So those people who are like Quakers, etc. There were no access to burials at certain places like St Paul's, Charles House and some of the hospitals. And during a plague year, the parish clerks would be completely overwhelmed, or in fact they might have died like in 1625. So we need to think about all those things when we're looking at the figures to do with deaths from plague. So as I say, the printed bills, and this is a printed bill, were distributed on Thursdays, and they were charged 1 penny or 4 shillings for a whole year. No advertisements were allowed in the publication. They were delivered to the King and the Lord Mayor, first by 8 AM, and they went on sale at 10 AM. So they wanted to get the news out really quickly, just in case disease was happening in the city and they could start to do something about it. We'll come back to those diseases. I'm sure you can read what some of those diseases are. We'll come back to those in a moment. Just to show you here, for instance, the one we're interested in the moment was plague. So as you can see, that week there were 43 died of plague in the City of London. Just got to remember, it's the City of London or the area of Bills of Mortality. Ignore all the other really interesting names at the moment. So what happened when the plague broke out in 1665? The King and the court moved to Oxfordshire. So they immediately cleared off, and that's what lots of rich people did. They immediately cleared off. The Lord Mayor, Sir John Lawrence, and most of the city aldermen remained at their posts. So well done the city at that point. Public gatherings were not allowed, except in church and cathedral services. Fairs were cancelled, schools were closed down, law courts stopped much of their function, coffee houses and inns closed, very early coffee houses. Watches were mounted on the gates to stop vagrants and dangerous people from coming in and into the city. That's what the city did. What the parish could do is they would set up burial procedures and pay for burials. They would pay weekly wages to the searchers or the nurses, etc. They would replace broken ropes that broke when the bells were rung so often that the ropes broke. Sheds were provided for the searchers, so that's away from the public, so that people had to look at all the bodies but go somewhere where they didn't mix with people. The parish clerk was meant to attend the burial and keep a record, and that's the record we're looking at. The poor often dispatched to pest houses. Pest houses were basically quarantine places where they wanted to put anybody who was ill and poor, put them out of the way and hopefully they won't affect anybody else. You have to remember there's no concept of how the process of the disease was proceeding, how people actually caught this disease. So no understanding that the disease was in fact caught from the fleas of rats that were passing on to human beings. People were shut up in houses by the parish, but they were allowed out after 9 p.m. Certainly that was in the early stages of the plague they were allowed out. Let's jump on. So let's look at the progress of the plague in 1665. So what I've done, I've taken a snapshot of the plague every fortnight from this date onwards. So here we see the lists of some of the diseases, and again, patience before we get on to what these diseases might be. But the one we're looking for is plague. So, 9th of May 1665, in the whole of London, just 3 people died of plague. And just be aware of these figures over here, which refer to other diseases. So I won't tell you what diseases are, but you watch these figures here go up at the same time as the plague figures go up. And I'll try and explain why that might be in a moment. So 2 weeks later, we get the 23rd of May. So plague is at the top. It's now gone up to 17. And I think these numbers have crept up a little bit. So plague is 17 2 weeks later. So in a non-plague year, you might expect to find 1 or 2 cases a week, possibly the plague, sometimes none. 17, then the authorities are starting to think, what's going on here? We might have an outbreak of plague, so they might be starting getting slightly worried. So that's 23rd of May 1665. Let's jump forward 2 more weeks. So, second one down is plague, 112 people. So that's 1 in every parish, basically, on average. 1 in every parish has died of the plague. You see this number here, they jumped up to, that one's jumped up to 98. I'll come back to that. So that's the 6th of June. So the significant thing about that is, 1, the numbers are going up, 2, it's summer. That's also significant. So we jump forward 2 weeks. So here's plague down here, 267, so it's more than doubled in 2 weeks. Nothing else has crept up very much. This is about the same as it was before. Another 2 weeks. So here's plague, 725. Just remember that's the whole of the City of London in just 1 week, 725 deaths. That number there has gone up, 116, but that's creeping up too. Another 2 weeks, 1,843. So if you imagine, you know when we worry about bird flu a few years ago, there's an outbreak possibly of Ebola in Africa. We start to worry when they have 5 or 6 people dying of bird flu in this country. Can you imagine in a city, and the city probably had a population of about 450,000, that nearly 2,000 people had died that week of plague. How people must have been feeling in a very close-knit community. And they will have noticed that the rich people were clearing off as quickly as they could, getting sort of passports to get out of the city. Now just imagine that feeling of 2,000 people have died around you that week, and you would have seen that happening around you. With the huge population we have today, we don't see those people dropping down dead of bird flu. They're in a hospital or they're cared for. These people would have been in your family or would be dropping down dead in the street. So 2 weeks later, 1st of August, we're into high summer now. So 2,817 people that week. So if you add them to what people have died already, you can see how many, now thousands of people have died already. That number there, still going up alongside. 2 weeks later, it's doubled, basically. 12,237. And again, these numbers jumping up here. 2 weeks later, 29th of August, 6,000, well, it's basically 7,000 people, just that week, dropping dead of the plague, whole families being completely wiped out by the plague. At this point, they're worrying what they're going to do with the bodies, and they start digging pits outside the city. They start to ban people being buried in parish churchyards, like the one just outside here. They start to build big pits and just dumping the bodies in them. Much as they did in the Black Death, and I'm sure you've all heard about the Crossrail project. They've just found a Black Death burial at Charterhouse Square, I think it is. There are plague pits all around the city, usually on the edges. So Charterhouse Square is significant because in the time of the Black Death, that was right on the edge of the city. So 7,000 people that week. And then we reached the peak. So the peak was in this week, the 12th of September. That's almost exactly a year before the Great Fire of London. So 2 disasters with all exactly a year. So over 7,000 people died of the plague just in that week. And then it starts to go down. And nobody's absolutely certain why it goes down. We'll come back to that in a moment. But let's just have a look at what's going on. So by September 1665, the death rate had reached nearly 8,000 a week. The municipal authorities, through their earlier caution to the wind, they just abandoned all the rules and regulations. They couldn't control what was going on. So many people were dying of the plague. The people who were searching were dying, the parish clerks were dying, so the whole administration starts to break up. Houses containing the dead and dying were no longer locked. So this is an image of what this is a contemporary image of what a house would be like. Locked up in your house with somebody dying of plague here, somebody possibly already dead of plague, somebody either in the coffin or the coffin waiting for the person. These are probably the searchers coming to look to see what you've died of, what disease you've died of. Tens of thousands of dogs were killed to eliminate the feared source of contagion, and mounds of rotting garbage were burned. So they had this idea that they were catching the plague from these dogs and cats all over the city. This was probably the last thing they should have done, because the cats were probably killing the rats who were actually the carriers of the plague, but they had no concept of that. So this is actually an image. This person looks like he's about to smash the head in of this dog, basically. These are the searchers with their staves. That's the sort of symbol of their office. Well-off residents had fled to the countryside, leaving the poor behind in impoverished and decrepit parishes. So I'm assuming this is what's happening here. This is the well-off people leaving. And this man here's got a sort of passport to leave the city for. And when he went to, if you read General Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, he recalls people trying to get into other towns who come from London. So I think he refers to Epping in Essex, where people in Epping wouldn't allow anybody who come from London to enter their town, made them stay out in the forest, brought them food, but would leave the food and then back away when they had to come collect it. So you needed documents to move around the city, to move out of the city, and also to move around the country, because people would suspect you were bringing the plague to their particular town, which you probably were. So you took your baggage with you, you're probably taking fleas with you, which will then pass on the contagion. So as you can see, people were looking for places. People started burying their own family. They no longer had somebody to dig the grave for them. Lots of the priests had died. Lots of priests had gone off. So you basically could be just looking after your family and then just burying them yourself, if you could afford to bury them at all. Or they'd be just thrown into pits that had been dug by the authorities. This is just a nice phrase I like. London's mournful silence was broken by the noise of carts carrying the dead for burial in parish churches or communal graves. Pits such as Finsbury Field in Cripplegate and the open fields in Southwark. So I can imagine that when we dig for the Crossrail or HS2 or anything, we're going to find more of those around the boundaries of the city, more plague pits. So as you can see down here, which may be St Giles Cripplegate, this is what they're trying to show, I think here. So just pits rather than individual graves, pits, and people were not being buried in coffins by the height of it. There just wasn't anybody in to make the coffins. Just thrown in with a shroud, sometimes just thrown into a pit. Where a whole family had died, you might just throw them all into one pit. And of course, all this time, people were coming up with ideas about where the plague came from, how the disease passed on, how it could be treated. So lots of people came up with wacky ideas for treating it. And this is an advertising bill from the time, and it says, this is a cure for the plague. Take a pint of new milk and cut 2 cloves of garlic, very small, put in the milk, and drink it at breakfast, basically mornings, fastings, and it will preserve us from infection. So I mean, it sounds pathetic to us today, maybe something in garlic warding off infection, but basically it's not going to cure the plague, and they came up with all different sorts of ideas of how you could treat the plague, and clearly none of them were going to work. But this is a little advertising bill that actually survives from the period. So let's look at the end of the year. There's a summary of how many people had died of the plague. So you can see here, 68,596 people had died of the plague. That's probably an underestimate, because do you remember I told you to keep your eye on that figure on the other column that kept going up? Well, basically, that column is probably to do with other infectious diseases. So consumption, people who died with other infections. What was happening, we believe, is that people didn't want records of plague in a particular house. They say, please don't say it's plague because of all those reasons I explained. Let's say it's consumption. So as the plague goes up, all the other diseases go up because they're shifting some of the figures from the plague over to other diseases for those reasons. So you see that lots of them go up. So here, consumption is 4,808 for the year. Not much difference between males and females. You can see here, this doesn't seem to have discriminated in any way between males and females. And the increase on last year, it shows you the increase on last year was clearly dramatic. So this is just a graph that I found that was quite interesting. This is St Paul's Covent Garden, so outside the city of London, which shows the plague going up, and it clearly goes up really dramatically. And it drops off dramatically too, and it goes completely flat, comes up a little bit in March, and then it just completely goes, completely disappears. Some people think the plague actually started in 1664. There's some records in St Giles in the Fields of some plague the year before. But basically after this, completely gone. I'll come back to that one in a minute. Right, let's look at some of those diseases. So whenever I show the Bills of Mortality to people, we always get it out as one of our treasures. People say to me, what's that disease, what's the other disease? And I don't know the answers to lots of these because I'm not an expert on medical history, but I can tell you what some of them are because I've had to look them up for you. So childbed fever, that's fairly obvious. That's fever following a woman giving birth, very common up until 20th century. The next one is chrism, which I think is on there. Chrism is, chrism in infants, 1,258 that year. Chrism was a face cloth, actually, a piece of linen that laid over a child's head when he or she was baptised or christened. But the term came to mean a child who died either before they were christened or within a month. So these are neonatal deaths, so they would have been very common. Children dying within the first month, so that's what that one means. Colic, so people, all babies get colic, but children died of colic in the 17th century. Consumption is, of course, tuberculosis, though whether in the 17th century they recognised distinctions between tuberculosis and other sorts of infection. Dropsy is a swelling often caused by kidney or heart disease. Dropsy still exists today. Fistula, which I think is probably on that one. Fistula is an abnormal opening between two organs. It can be anywhere apart from the body, but it sounds really disgusting. Flux, which is what lots of people died of, flux, is to do with either excessive flow or discharge of fluid, like hemorrhage or diarrhea. Sorry about this. Griping of the guts, which is one that people always ask me. We're not absolutely sure. It could be food poisoning. It could be just abdominal infection, diarrhea, etc. in children. So much as lots of children in the third world are dying of diarrhea. In 17th century London, that was happening in the same way. Impostume, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Impostume is an abscess. King's evil is scrofula. So that's the tuberculosis of the neck or lymph glands. Purples, which I think is on that one, it's only on other ones. Purple seems to be very common, but nobody's absolutely sure what it was. Spotted fever is either typhus or meningitis. Strangury is rupture. Tissick is another word for consumption. So clearly, in the 17th century, they thought tissick and consumption were two different things. We think they probably are the same thing. Tympany is distension of the abdomen resulting from the accumulation of gas or air in the intestines. I'm not sure why so many people got this. It's probably to do with their diet, bad food, bad water, etc. And worm fit is convulsions associated with teething, worms, elevated temperature or diarrhea. So lots of those are going to be to do with very young children and babies. And I just thought there were some interesting statistics just to finish with, and they are these. So you can see this is 1665, 68,596 people died of plague. The ones in red are infective diseases, are infections, so they're going to be the ones we will now treat with antibiotics. So you can see the ones in red are those. The ones in black are non-infections, so diseases other than that, like cancer, etc. But really interestingly down here it says, in 1665, 93% of people died of infection. And in 1997, in America, only 4% of people who died in America in that year died of infection. 1998, 25% of the people who died in the world died of infection. So it just shows you, really, how much we owe to antibiotics. Because basically, if we didn't have antibiotics, we might be up to these sorts of levels of death from infection. That's what they couldn't do in the 17th century, was treat or ameliorate any of the effects of the plague, because they had no antibiotics. And that is the story of the Bills of Mortality. Thank you very much.